I dropped my duffel by the door and stepped into the house, the familiar scent of pine wood and old books settling around me. The place was quiet. Too quiet. Vanessa was supposed to be home. A glance at the kitchen told me she hadn't bothered to cook. I didn't expect her to. She hadn't been much for home life in a long time. I walked into the bedroom, kicked off my boots, and reached for the stack of books on her nightstand. That's when I saw it tucked between pages of some highbrow business leadership manual she'd probably never read. A letter. Handwritten. My name wasn't on the envelope, but I knew the handwriting wasn't hers. I pulled it out and unfolded it, the paper crisp like it hadn't been handled much. Vanessa, I can't stop thinking about you. The way you laugh at my terrible jokes, the way you challenge me. You make me feel alive. I don't know how much longer I can do this, hiding in stolen moments, pretending we're just colleagues. I need you. I need us. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I'd heard her mention Darren Novak enough times to know. Senior VP at her firm. Married with 2 kids. A real go-getter, ambitious, cut from the same cloth as Vanessa. I sat on the edge of the bed, letter in one hand, my other resting on my knee. My heart didn't speed up. My breathing stayed steady. I had seen enough in my life to know how to handle a threat. And that's what this was. A direct hit to my home, my life, my name. Boone padded into the room, ears perked, sensing something was off. I scratched the back of his neck, then folded the letter and slipped it back into the book exactly where I'd found it. No need to tip my hand. Not yet. I walked out onto the porch, lighting a cigarette out of habit more than need. The sky was darkening over the treetops, the last streaks of gold fading into blue. My father's voice echoed in my head, you don't react. You observe. You plan. Vanessa pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later, stepping out of her sleek company car like she was still in an office, moving with that purposeful stride, phone in one hand, bag in the other. She barely glanced at me as she passed. Long day? I asked, my voice even. Yeah, she said, tapping away at her screen. Meetings ran over. I nodded. Dinner. She sighed like I'd asked for something outrageous. I grabbed something on the way. She didn't ask about my trip, didn't care to know how it had gone. I let that settle. Once she would have. I watched her disappear inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood. Something in the way she carried herself, relaxed, assured, untouchable, told me she had no idea I knew. Good. That would make what came next easier. The next morning, I drove into town. The Rusted Elk sat on the main stretch, a no-frills place that hadn't changed much in 20 years. It smelled like sawdust and whiskey, the way a bar should. Sam Brooks was behind the counter, drying glasses, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She barely looked up as I slid onto a stool. You're back, she said, setting a glass down. Beer? Coffee? She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She poured a cup and leaned against the bar. Trip go all right? Fine. I sipped the coffee. Vanessa been in lately? Sam gave me a look, then smirked. Depends. You asking as a husband or just making conversation? I held her gaze. She let out a breath, tapping her fingers against the counter. Yeah. She's been in a few times. Usually alone, sometimes with some clean-cut city guy. Suit, expensive watch. Your type of crowd. I nodded. They look close. Sam scoffed. Looked like they had business to discuss. If by business you mean sitting in the corner talking low and laughing at all the right moments. I finished my coffee, sliding a few bills across the counter. Let me know if you see them again. She took the money, eyes sharp. You gonna do something about it? I met her gaze. Yeah. Just not yet. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. I got in my truck and headed for Vanessa's office. Time to see how deep this ran. I pulled into a parking spot across from Vanessa's office, a sleek glass building that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop of the mountains. The kind of place where people wore expensive watches and had assistants schedule their emotions. I'd been here a handful of times over the years, company events, holiday parties where I shook hands with men who smiled too much and women who looked past me like I wasn't worth their time. Fine by me. I wasn't their kind of people. I walked inside, boots scuffing against the polished floor, taking in the rush of suits moving with purpose. Nobody paid attention to me, which was exactly what I wanted. The front desk was manned by a woman I recognized, Bella Price. Mid-40s, tired eyes, professional smile that didn't quite reach her face. The type who noticed everything but kept her mouth shut. She looked up from her screen and blinked. Surprised. Mr. Morris. Didn't expect to see you here. Figured I'd surprise Vanessa. She in. Bella's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She, just stepped out. Meeting across town. I leaned on the counter, studying her. That's so? Bella hesitated. She wasn't stupid. She knew the game. Office politics, who was climbing over who was sleeping with who. I waited. Let the silence work for me. She glanced around, then lowered her voice. Look, I don't want to get involved, but your wife and Darren have been leaving together a lot. Same time, same days. People talk. She sighed, rubbing her temple. I don't know if it's what you think, but it sure looks like it. I nodded. Appreciate it, Bella. She looked relieved when I turned to leave. I stepped outside, the cold air sharp against my face. That was confirmation enough. I didn't need to know how many nights, how many hotel rooms. The details didn't matter. What mattered was making sure they paid for it. I drove to a diner off the main road, ordered a black coffee, and pulled out my phone. Angela Novak's number wasn't hard to find. I sent a text. We need to talk. It's about Darren and Vanessa. The dots blinked on the screen, then disappeared. A minute later, my phone rang. Her voice was sharp, guarded. Who is this? Levi Morris. Silence. Then, why are you texting me? I think you already know. Pause, a slow inhale. Where? I gave her the name of the diner. She hung up without another word. 20 minutes later, a sleek SUV pulled up. Angela stepped out, dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, heels clicking against the pavement. She walked in like she owned the place, slid into the booth across from me. Up close, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled into a fist before she flattened them against the table. She didn't waste time. What do you have? I pulled out my phone, opened the picture I'd taken of the letter, turned the screen toward her. She stared at it, jaw tightening. That son of a bitch. I slid the phone back. Figured you should know. She let out a slow breath, rubbing her temple. I knew something was off. The late nights, the business trips that didn't make sense. She looked up, eyes sharp. What do you want from me? Nothing. I sipped my coffee. But if you're looking to make him pay, I won't stop you. She studied me, trying to read what kind of man I was. You're not here to beg her to come back? I almost laughed. No. She leaned back, nodding slowly. Good. Because I want them to burn. I liked her already. Angela wasn't stupid. She had her own resources, her own ways of gathering evidence, but together we could make sure neither of them walked away from this clean. We talked logistics, proof, leverage, timing. She'd handle Darren's career fallout. I'd handle Vanessa's. By the time we left, there was an unspoken agreement between us. No second chances. No forgiveness. Just consequences. I stepped out into the cold, the wind carrying the scent of snow and pine. Vanessa thought she was untouchable. Darren thought he was clever. They had no idea what was coming. I spent the next few days gathering what I needed. No rushing, no reckless moves. Just quiet, deliberate steps. Vanessa still had no idea anything was different. She came home late, showered off the day like she was scrubbing away guilt, then slid into bed beside me as if she hadn't been in another man's arms. I didn't say a word, didn't press. Let her think she still had control of the story. Angela moved fast. She had access to Darren's personal schedule, knew which accounts he handled, who his real allies were at the firm. More importantly, she had a lawyer already working the angles of her divorce. She sent me a message the morning after we met. I have a contact who can help us with proof. Proof. I already had the letter, the late-night meetings, the little shifts in Vanessa's behavior that screamed guilt to a man who knew how to read signs. But proof wasn't just about knowing. It was about making sure no one could deny it. I called Angela's contact that afternoon, a private investigator named Mark Daniels, a man who made a living tracking the careless footsteps of unfaithful spouses. I don't do gossip work, he said, voice like gravel. If you want blurry photos from across a parking lot, call someone else. I want confirmation, I said. Timestamps, locations, solid evidence. A pause. Then, that I can do. I wired him the deposit and sent Vanessa's schedule, the locations Angela provided where Darren was known to frequent. I had no doubt he'd get what we needed. Meanwhile, I worked on my own angles. I started with Vanessa's finances. We had a shared account, but she had a personal one too, the one she used for business travel, gifts, things she didn't think I noticed. I did. A few calls to a friend who worked in banking gave me enough to confirm what I suspected: frequent charges at a high-end lodge outside Boulder. A place I'd never been invited to. That night, over dinner, I leaned back in my chair and let my voice stay casual. How was work? Vanessa barely looked up from her plate. Fine. Long meetings. Yeah? You staying in Denver next week? She hesitated just for a second. A blink and you miss it pause before she nodded. Yeah. Same hotel. She was lying. I knew it. She had no idea I did. The next morning, I took Boone for a long walk in the woods behind the house, the air sharp and cold, my boots crunching over frozen ground. I thought about my father, about the way he used to hunt. You don't chase the prey, he'd say. You let it come to you. Vanessa was walking into a trap she didn't even know was there. A week later, Daniels called. Got what you need. I met him in a parking lot outside a gas station just past the county line. He was an older guy, solid build, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He handed me a folder, then a USB drive. Photos, videos, receipts. Your wife's got expensive taste. So does her boyfriend. I flipped through the photos. Vanessa and Darren sitting too close at a bar. A lingering hand on her thigh. Them walking into the lodge together, her laughing at something he said. Her keycard opening a private suite. I closed the folder. Good work. He nodded, took his payment, and drove off. I sat there for a long moment, hands on the wheel, Boone shifting in the passenger seat. There it was. Undeniable proof. Vanessa had made her choice. Now I was making mine. I kept the folder in the truck, tucked under the seat. No need to look at it again. I'd seen enough. The pictures weren't a surprise, just confirmation. The real work started now. Angela and I met at a quiet diner off the highway, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and frying bacon no matter the time of day. She was already at a booth when I walked in, stirring sugar into her coffee like it had done something to offend her. She looked up when I sat down, eyes sharp. You have it? She asked. I slid the folder across the table. She opened it, flipping through the pages, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a slow breath and leaned back, tapping a nail against the table. Bastard didn't even try to hide it. Neither did she, I said. She closed the folder, set it aside. All right, here's how we handle this. Angela had spent years in the same circles as Darren and Vanessa, knew exactly where to press to make the most damage. The company had strict ethics policies, not that they ever stopped executives from screwing around. But public humiliation? That was different. No CEO wanted their top brass tangled in a scandal that could make shareholders nervous. I'll send this to the board anonymously, she said, tapping the folder. With a nice little note about how inappropriate relationships between senior leadership and direct reports undermine company integrity. She smirked. They'll eat it up. And Vanessa? I asked. Angela tilted her head, considering. Your move. I nodded. I already knew how I'd handle her. By the time I got home, Vanessa was already there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I walked in. How was your day? She asked, voice absent. Productive, I said. She made a noise, something noncommittal, then went back to her phone. I stood there for a moment, watching her. She had no idea what was coming. That night, I drafted the email. I kept it simple. No threats. No emotion. Just the facts. Attached a few key photos, a couple of expense reports I'd pulled from her transactions. Sent it to her family, a few close friends, and her brother who'd always had a habit of running his mouth. I knew the moment it landed. Vanessa was in the shower when her phone started buzzing. Over and over. I sat on the porch, a beer in hand, Boone at my feet, listening to the distant sound of her ringtone, the chime of incoming texts. I waited. Then, through the screen door, I heard her voice. What the hell? She came out a second later, still wrapped in a towel, phone gripped tight in her hand. Levi, she said, voice sharp. What did you do? I looked up at her, took a slow sip of my beer. I don't know, Vanessa. Why don't you tell me? Her face went pale. She shook her head, stepping forward. You don't understand. I can explain. Can you? I said, standing. She opened her mouth, then shut it. She wasn't stupid. She saw it in my face. There was no talking her way out of this. Her phone rang again. She looked down at the screen, then swore under her breath. Probably her boss. Maybe her family. Either way, her world was unraveling in real time. I stepped past her into the house. Pack a bag, I said. You're leaving tonight? She didn't argue. She knew there was nothing left to say. Vanessa packed fast. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my beer, listening to the sounds of drawers opening and closing, the hurried shuffle of clothes being stuffed into a suitcase. No words, no pleading, just quiet panic. She knew she couldn't talk her way out of this. That part was already done. Boone stretched out on the floor beside me, watching with lazy interest. The house felt different already, like it was shaking off a bad smell. Vanessa came down the hall, suitcase in one hand, phone clutched in the other. Her face was tight, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She'd been putting out fires all evening, her brother calling, her friends bombarding her with messages, her boss demanding an explanation she couldn't give. She stopped at the doorway, gripping the handle of her suitcase. "Where am I supposed to go?" I shrugged. "Not my problem." Her jaw clenched. "This isn't fair." I set my beer down. "Fair?" I let the words sit between us, let her hear how stupid it sounded. "You threw this away, Vanessa. You don't get to stand there and cry about it now." She looked down, her knuckles white around the phone. "I didn't mean it." "Yeah, you did," I cut in. "You just didn't think you'd get caught." She swallowed, then let out a slow breath. "I loved you, Levi." I stood, grabbed my keys off the counter. "Well, you had a funny way of showing it." I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped aside. "Go." She hesitated, like she thought maybe there was still some way to fix it, but she must have seen something in my face that told her otherwise. She pulled her suitcase over the threshold, stepped out into the cold, and didn't look back. The porch light cast a long shadow as she walked toward her car, and then, just like that, she was gone. I closed the door behind her, exhaled, and let the silence settle in. Boone got up, stretched, then trotted over and sat at my feet. I scratched his head, the motion slow, thoughtful. It was done. The next morning, I drove into town. Stopped at the Rusted Elk for a coffee, the weight of the last few days starting to ease. Sam was behind the bar, wiping down a glass, her dark eyes watching as I slid onto a stool. She tilted her head, smirked. "You look lighter," she said. I took a sip of coffee. "Something like that." She tossed the rag over her shoulder, leaned on the bar. "Word's getting around." "Not surprised." She shrugged. "Some people say you went too far." I raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think?" She grinned. I think she had it coming. A slow nod. I liked Sam. She didn't sugarcoat things. She let the silence sit for a moment, then reached under the bar, grabbed a folded newspaper, and slid it toward me. "Page 3, she said. I opened it, scanning until my eyes landed on the headline. Senior VP resigns amid ethics scandal. I skimmed the article, catching the keywords: inappropriate relationship, violation of company policy, departure effective immediately. Darren was done. I folded the paper, set it aside. Angela works fast. Sam smirked. "Remind me never to piss off you too." I finished my coffee, left a tip on the counter, and walked out into the crisp morning air. The sky was clear, the sun breaking over the ridgeline, warming the cold edges of the town. I had things to do, land to tend, a business to run. Vanessa and Darren could dig themselves out of their own mess. I had no more time to waste on them. I spent the next few days cleaning house, literally and figuratively. Vanessa had left some things behind, little traces of her life here. I packed them up, drove to the donation center, and dropped them off without a second thought. Her key was already on the counter when she left, but just to be sure, I changed the locks. Not that I expected her to come back. She wasn't the type to fight for something once she'd lost it. Angela kept me updated, not that I needed much. Darren had been forced out, no severance, no golden parachute. The company framed it as a voluntary resignation, but we both knew better. His wife filed for divorce the same week. Vanessa, on the other hand, was trying to land on her feet, but the weight of it all was dragging her down. Losing her job meant losing the respect of the people she spent years trying to impress. Her name was in every whispered conversation at the country club, every side-eyed glance at corporate functions. She hadn't just burned bridges, she detonated them. I didn't bother following up. I had better things to do. One morning, I loaded up the truck with gear and headed for the mountains. Boone rode shotgun, ears perked, eyes sharp. He knew where we were going before we even got there. A few miles off the main road, I pulled up to the cabin my father built when I was a kid. It was nothing fancy, just wood and nails and history. The kind of place that made sense in a world that didn't. I spent the day repairing what needed fixing, chopping wood, reinforcing the front steps. The work was good, steady. It kept my hands busy, my mind clear. When the sun started dipping below the tree line, I built a fire, sat on the porch with a beer, and watched the light fade. Boone settled at my feet, letting out a slow breath. I scratched his head, watching the embers glow in the fire pit. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. No phone calls, no emails, no noise. just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. For the first time in a long while, everything felt right. The past was where it belonged, behind me. The future was mine to shape, no dead weight holding me back. I'd handled it the way it needed to be handled. No begging, no second chances, just consequences. I took another sip of beer, let the quiet settle in. It was a good night. A month passed. The snow came early that year, dusting the pines in white, settling thick along the ridgelines. Business slowed, but I didn't mind. The quiet suited me. I ran a few guided hunts for some old clients, spent the rest of my time working the land, fixing up the cabin, taking Boone out on long treks through the backcountry. It felt good to be moving forward without the weight of someone else's mistakes dragging behind me. Vanessa never reached out, not that I expected her to. I heard things, though. In a town like this, you always do. She tried sticking around at first, showing up to corporate mixers, acting like nothing had changed, but it didn't take long before she figured it out. People weren't impressed by her anymore. They weren't whispering about her promotions or her sharp business mind. They were whispering about how she'd lost everything in the span of a few weeks. The invitations stopped coming. The ones she still received, people only invited her to watch her squirm. She lasted another month before packing up and leaving. Rumor was she moved to Denver, took some lower-rung job at a smaller firm. A steep drop for someone who used to walk like she owned every room she stepped into. Darren fared worse. His wife bled him dry in the divorce, took the house, the kids, left him scraping together what was left of his savings. He tried getting hired somewhere else, but the stain of his resignation followed him. Nobody wanted to touch him. Last I heard, he was running some consulting business out of a shared office space, pretending he hadn't fallen from grace. Some men learn, some don't. He was the latter. Angela reached out once, just to let me know how everything shook out. We kept it short. No need to dwell. She got what she wanted, I got what I needed. That was enough. One night, I walked into the Rusted Elk, shook the snow off my jacket, and took my usual seat at the bar. Sam slid a whiskey in front of me before I even had to ask. "Looking better these days," she said, wiping down the counter. I took a sip, let the burn settle in my chest. "Feels that way." She leaned in slightly. "So what now? Gonna ride off into the sunset?" I smirked. "Something like that." She laughed, shaking her head. "Well, don't disappear too long. You're about the only guy who drinks whiskey in this place without crying into it." "Not my style." "Yeah," she said, tossing the rag over her shoulder. "Figured that out." I finished my drink, left cash on the counter, and stepped back into the cold. The snow was falling steady now, fat flakes drifting down through the streetlights, muffling the sound of the town settling in for the night. I pulled my jacket tighter, headed for the truck, Boone trotting beside me. I had a cabin in the woods, a business I built with my own hands, and nothing tying me down. No betrayal lingering in the air, no lies waiting to be uncovered. Just the land, the mountains, and the open road whenever I felt like taking it. I climbed into the truck, turned the key, and let the engine rumble to life. The road stretched ahead, clear and open. I drove forward and didn't look back.